Good morning, everybody. And for those on the East Coast, it's actually getting into afternoon here, but here in Minnesota, it's 11 o'clock. And welcome to our webinar on mindfulness. We're just happy that you could join us and so glad that you can be with us today. As I said, we're from Minnesota. Our speaker today is going to be Linda Harvey, and she is from Ohio. And we have people who are joining us from all over the country. So we just appreciate this opportunity here to do this. This is Child Protection League. I'm Julie Quist with Child Protection League, and you can find us on the website at cplaction.com, cplaction.com. And we have a whole section on SEL, and we have some things on mindfulness. This is our second webinar that we're doing. The last one we did was on the Title IX briefing on what's coming down from the federal government, and you can find that on our website also. If you have any experiences that you want to share with us about the issue of mindfulness, that you think might be helpful for people to know or for us to know, you can reach us at contact@cplaction.com. So you're welcome to send anything to us. Okay, so I am going to begin by introducing Linda Harvey. And if Linda can join us by her screen there. Linda Harvey is president and founder of Mission America, and that's a media outreach. She founded that in 1995, and it features Christian commentary on the current cultural issues. Mission America grew out of her advertising and public relations career. She is the author of 2 books and hundreds of articles that are published on various sites. Among them are like the Christian Post. There's a site called The Stand, American Thinker, WorldNet Daily, places like that. Her weekly radio commentaries are broadcast on the Salem Radio Network in Columbus, Ohio. And Linda's a frequent guest on talk shows all over the country. She testifies often on legislation at the Ohio State House, and she's a regular conference speaker, so keep her in mind if you're organizing a speaker. So Linda Harvey serves on the board of Protect Ohio Children. She's a graduate of Miami University of Ohio, and she is a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. So that's who Linda is. And Linda, you're on here. So I'll just hand it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. I'm so honored to be able to do this today. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on mindfulness. And I'm so honored that Child Protection League has organized this, and I want to thank them for allowing this opportunity for this important discussion to be out there. So let's just start right in. I don't know if you've heard about this practice called mindfulness. It seems to be out there a lot. It's getting a lot more attention because it's showing up in schools at quite an alarming rate. If you want to know, by the way, any more about what we are talking about today, my website for our organization is missionamerica.com. So write that down if you would, and we'll be mentioning that again later, missionamerica.com. So if we could we're going to have some PowerPoints. If we could just start our PowerPoints now. Here's the problem with this so-called mindfulness. It's essentially a practice based in Buddhism and Hinduism, repackaged for school children. And so, by the way, this is showing up in the corporate world as well, but we're only going to deal with the schools today. But it's coming into schools as a subset often of social emotional learning. We'll touch on that a little bit later in case you're not familiar with that. But it's where many of the originators of social emotional learning, SEL, wanted that aspect and that framework to go all along. The roots of SEL are in this so-called mindful education, and we're seeing more and more schools diving into such lessons as part of social emotional learning. And mindfulness can seem innocuous at first, but often it's quite openly religious, leading children into occult beliefs, Eastern meditation, and New Age practices. So what I'm going to do today is walk us through how this got started, what's involved in mindfulness, where it's being used in schools, what the results are, and what we can do about it. And any questions, again, throw those into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to whatever we can. So let's go to the next slide. So let's start with some definitions. And I'm got these definitions based on what either advocates of SEL or those who purport to be neutral are saying. Let's start with good old Wikipedia. They're supposedly neutral, but they come right out and tell us that mindfulness derives from sati, a significant element of Hindu and Buddhist traditions, and is based on Zen, Vipassana, and Tibetan meditation techniques. So there you go, right there. Castle. Now, for those that are not familiar with SEL, let me just touch on Castle because it's very important here to the origin of social emotional learning, but also mindfulness. CASEL is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, started in the 1990s, and is kind of the mothership of all of this, social emotional learning and also mindfulness in schools. So they define mindfulness as maintaining a moment-by-moment awareness of our thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, surrounding environment through a gentle, nurturing lens. Well, that sounds just so innocuous, doesn't it? Yeah, so we'll see if that holds up, or is it more like the original definition here, the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Well, let's go to a third definition, and this is from the UNESCO people, which is UN, and they make a clear tie to mindfulness, even mindfulness-based social emotional learning. And they tell us what happens. Mindfulness works from the inside out, and social emotional learning works from the outside in. And when you connect the two practices together, you create a heart-centered and sustainable approach to learning. My goodness, how could anybody object to that? Well, let's look a little bit closer. This is what they say. Well, some alarmed parents would define mindfulness quite a bit differently. So let's go to the next slide. So let's go to the origins of school-based mindfulness, and it comes right out of the Fetzer Institute. The Fetzer Institute was organized by John Fetzer, and I'll talk about him in a moment, but they talk frankly about the potential of the spiritual dimension in whole child development. Now, the whole child approach is where the schools want to take all of this if we will let them. They want to be the child's spiritual guide, as well as when they get around to academics every once in a while, they want that as well. But so much is becoming therapy or pseudo-therapy, values clarification, and so much more that's not academics. Even they've talked about the science of teen spirituality. You'll hear a lot in the discussion of mindfulness about so-called science or brain science. It's not spirituality, it's science, folks. And we've heard that story before about follow the science when there's no intention to do so, and sometimes there's no science there. So let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about the pioneers here. John Fetzer he founded he founded the Fetzer Institute. He passed away in 1991, but Castle, from his institute, which is very focused on neo-pagan and occult religions, as well as a smattering of Judeo-Christian, more progressive faiths. But the Fetzer Institute founded Castle, the Collaborative for Social and Emotional Learning, in 1994. A little bit about John Fetzer. He was the owner of the Detroit Tigers. He also had owned radio stations and cable television, but his real fascination was with the paranormal. He was an occultist who was fascinated by Alice Bailey. If you've ever kept up with New Age practices, she was an occultist who started the Lucis Trust originally the Lucifer Trust. So there were some real spooky things going on here right from the beginning at the Fetzer Institute. They're the ones that founded this social emotional learning castle, the mothership of SEL. And then the Fetzer Institute took up the work of John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts Medical School on mindfulness-based stress reduction. And then he wanted to promote it in the schools. And he was very popular early on in the schools. And also they worked with a guy named Dan Goleman, who had very supposedly pioneering work on what is called emotional intelligence. That was he wrote books on that, a big thing in the 90s, which morphed into, in the school setting, CASEL, social emotional learning. And they also consulted the work of a Buddhist monk called Thich Nhat Hanh. I think I've got the pronunciation right. So lots of occult elements here, and therapy-based occult elements that went into the original development of school mindfulness. So let's go to the next slide. Another person is Linda Lantieri. She was a co-founder of CASEL. Linda Lantieri is a person who has taught at the Columbia University Teachers College for quite a while. And that's a very progressive, very prestigious among education circles, Teachers College, but very, very progressive. She founded the Inner Resilience Program in New York City, started after 9/11. And she's been involved, here's what the slide says, in designing and leading the concentration in spirituality in K through 12 education since its beginning in 2014 at Columbia University Teachers College. The Columbia University website has a Spirituality Institute and has a major on spirituality in education, if you can believe that. So they see, quote, spirituality as a protective factor against mental illness, unquote. So just ponder that for a moment. They want this in K through 12 schools. This is where all these new counselors being hired, and SEL programs may want to take our children to solve all their mental and emotional health problems. The mental health crisis we know is raging among our kids. So mindfulness advocates talk about this spirituality, but it's the science of spirituality. The awakened brain is another thing you will hear discussed. And that is a language commonly used to sell schools. Oh yeah, this is all about the latest science on brain, the awakened brain, and on neurology. But there has been a deliberate attempt in promoting this in schools and getting schools on board and comforting parents where they know what's going on about, oh no, this is not spirituality, to detach mindfulness in schools from its clearly Buddhist and occult origins. And but social emotional learning, CASEL, was spiritually oriented from the beginnings. They are, as you probably know, social emotional learning is well entrenched in schools. Mindfulness is going to come right along beside it, and it was there from the start. So let's go to the next slide. Some other people that put this, jump-started this whole mindfulness thing are some celebrities and sports figures and politicians. Goldie Hawn. She has been a Buddhist practitioner, meditation practitioner for a long time. She founded a foundation, the Hawn Foundation, and created a social emotional learning mindfulness program called Mind Up. Mind Up gets the highest marks from CASEL. Again, the ground zero for social emotional learning. So she has been promoting mindfulness on this under her Mind Up program for a number of years. It heavily emphasizes flat out meditation. She herself will try to convince people that it is also secular. and she's received millions of dollars in grants from the U.S. Department of Education. Another person is former Congressman Tim Ryan from here in the Youngstown area in my state of Ohio. He wrote a book on what he considered the benefits of meditation for schools, and he got federal funding for schools in Northeast Ohio. Parents were not all happy on this, as you might imagine, and some of those programs ended, but some did not. There have been mindfulness lessons as well as yoga, which is often quite connected to the mindfulness mindset in some schools in North Central Ohio several years ago. And I'll talk more specifically about what they did there in a little bit. Strongly motivating parents and churches to work together to object to this. So the website for Tim Ryan's program, Mindful Nation, explains how this dovetails with social emotional learning. So just listen to this. The social emotional skills imparted to the children as part of the program address self-management, self-awareness, social awareness, and relationship skills, and ultimately lead to more responsible decision-making, unquote. Those are the 5 competencies of SEL. So they're just weaving this mindfulness into what's already there on social emotional learning. I guess we can dispense with all those other mindfulness applications we're seeing and go straight to meditation, right? And we won't have any more intrusive surveys or data mining of our children and so on that sneaks in with SEL. I will talk later about how mindfulness will act as a steroid, if you will, on those 5 social emotional learning competencies. So then also Coach Phil Jackson and Kobe Bryant made videos to promote, this is a while ago because Kobe Bryant is no longer with us, but to promote, they were big on meditation. Schools in Minnesota used those during mindfulness lessons as well. So let's go to the next slide. More celebrities. This is 15 years ago or so, where all of this really got started. They needed money. So Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr were big advocates for meditation in schools for kids through the David Lynch Foundation. In 2009, they did a big concert with a lot of other stars. All the proceeds, I think $3 million went to this David Lynch Foundation. Now, David Lynch is a guy who was a producer of shows like Twin Peaks, that he wanted to get mindfulness into the schools. The Beatles, Paul and Ringo, were motivated by the fact that you may remember that they traveled to India in the 1960s and became practitioners of Eastern meditation and religion. And so the David Lynch Foundation, let's go to the next slide, has a program called Quiet Time. And it is flat out transcendental meditation. They're in San Francisco, they're in Chicago. They say every child, this is a New York Times article promoting that, very biased in favor of this, every child should have 1 class period a day to dive within himself. Really? So this is the way, and mindfulness is the way to save the coming generation. Keep that attitude in mind as we go through this, and as you begin to see mindfulness in more and more spots. That's the New York Times. So his program called Quiet Time is just one of the many trying to sell their programs as secular when they clearly have roots in Buddhism and Eastern religions. Now, here's even a statement on the David Lynch website. Now, listen closely to this. Quote, "The transcendental meditation technique was selected as the primary strategy taught in the Quiet Time program because it is a simple, easily learned, and secular, non-religious technique that has a large body of evidence supporting its effectiveness for youth and adults." He says, they say it's transcendental meditation, and right in the same sentence, call it secular. How stupid do they think we are? I mean, come on. So it's definitely not secular. Recently in Chicago, a girl who was a student and had already graduated She received a $150,000 settlement from her school. She sued both her school and the David Lynch Foundation, and it took 4 years. This was an incident that happened in 2020 that required students to speak mantras with the names of Eastern Hindu gods as part of this quiet time mindfulness lesson. So this young woman filed a complaint that this violated her Christian faith. And so good for her. So next slide. So let's look at how aggressively you're thinking, okay, mindfulness. It is very timely because as we sent out the notice for this webinar, I think the Lord is helping us here to weave the need together. I got a notice from my friend Diane Gramley, who is executive director of American Family Association of Pennsylvania, who's told me that just now a bill has been introduced in the Pennsylvania legislature that would require 15 minutes of mindfulness each day in K through 12 schools. And so here's how this bill defines mindfulness. It says, quote, mindfulness shall mean the practice of being aware of one's body, mind, and feelings in the present moment, unquote. Now, doesn't that just sound like everyone would want that, right? Well, what does this mean? This sounds like typical doublespeak that happens quite often in our schools, unfortunately, which is not really telling us much about what's actually going on. The bill states another deception, that these lessons, quote, are not intended to be and shall not be conducted as a religious service or exercise, unquote. Well, the intention may, and I emphasize may, not be intended to connect with spiritual entities, but the entire process invites that result, and it's only people who are unfamiliar with the spiritual world and how Buddhism works or claim they are who could make such a statement. More on the government's backing for mindfulness. Goldie Hawn's Mind Up program has been listed as a promising program by the U.S. Department of Justice. So expect more and more government push for this. And again, mindfulness advocates are going to tell us that they're accessing the best knowledge about brain science, and it's not Buddhism, folks, it's science, and that's going to be their story. So the next slide, please. So there's another hook for incorporating mindfulness into schools. It's being advocated as being needed to satisfy diversity, equity, and inclusion goals. How about that? That mindfulness brings, this is according to one advocate of this, brings core awareness necessary to address biases and break down barriers in creating inclusive communities that actively promote social, economic, and educational equity and racial justice. Wow. And world peace, I guess, as well. So occult spiritual practices are going to bring about racial justice. I'm not seeing that, and I bet you're not seeing that either. But that's the sales issue. So apart from the DEI sales effort, the schools are advocating mindfulness with another appeal, that there is a need to help children who are more stressed than ever before. And we know that is true, that more children than ever before have anxiety issues or behavioral issues. Suicide rates have risen dramatically among teens in recent years. And to be fair, educators often are very concerned about their kids, and they're looking for ways to fix these children. And in the process, of course, they're trying to fix the whole child and grab more and more of the parenting role. And that is not the lane they should be in. They need to stay in their lane. And they're also trying to control unmanageable classrooms. Let's be frank about that. But is at-school therapy, which is what social emotional learning is that what's going to help? And now spiritual rituals, is this the answer? I think most of us would agree, no, since mindfulness is virtually never a Christian practice. Notice what is completely missing in all of this discussion. And it is when you look up all of the voluminous material that you will find on the internet. If you start to hear during a mindfulness lesson or even a discussion about mindfulness in an article, is a word that starts with P, and that is prayer, because the techniques and approach are decidedly not Judeo-Christian. They come directly from Eastern pagan religious traditions, distinctly different from Christian meditation. Because it's so different than Christian meditation and prayer, I mean, Christian-based meditation, mindfulness focuses on one's self, your senses, your surroundings, calming oneself even by emptying your mind, losing your sense of right and wrong, not praying to Jesus Christ and our Almighty God, which are never mentioned here. This is a Christ-free program, and yet it's all about spirituality, whether they will admit it or not. So in the condition of the mind vacuum is always the possibility of demonic deception. Let's have the next slide, please. So here's, as much as I can tell, they vary, but this is what typically happens as mindfulness is done in classes. Children are instructed to sit comfortably, assume a calm demeanor, sometimes close their eyes and open their arms in the meditative pose that you see in meditation, Buddhist meditation, yoga, etc. Sometimes the teacher will use a bell or a gong to start the quiet session, which is also quite common in Eastern meditation rituals. They are to focus on their breathing, notice the sensations of their body, and then they can repeat in their mind a word over and over, a phrase over and over, which many of us will recognize as a mantra, common to many pagan practices, which produces a semi-conscious, even hypnotic state. The children are sometimes told they can send out good wishes with their mind, not pray for anyone, but send out good wishes, let their imaginations run free while they have their eyes closed and stay in a quiet pose. So, what spiritual contact will children make in such a situation, especially as this is repeated over and over? And children are encouraged to also do this at home. Well, sometimes there'll be no spiritual contact, but sometimes a lot. These sessions may become blatantly spiritual, as I mentioned in the Chicago settlement situation on the Quiet Time program before, with meditation and guided imagery and even more openly occult rituals. So much depends on the teacher, and the teacher is the wild card here in all these programs. Since many of the teachers have been instructed in the deepest and darkest, frankly, levels of mindfulness, many of these teachers are quite eager to usher their children in to and push this to the limits. Not all will be, but some definitely will be. One of the board members of Child Protection League told Julie Quist, and she passed it on to me, quote, my grandchildren have already been taught mindfulness in their classrooms. She mentioned her two grandchildren's names. To supposedly good suburban schools. And they know all about meditation, meditating cross-legged on when I brought the subject up to them. If I get any window of time, I'm still quoting her, I try to explain about Buddhism versus our God in Jesus. One of her granddaughter was kind of bowing and saying a stot or some greeting like that. And after I explained the religious aspect, she quit using it. I had to be part of what she learned at school or she wouldn't know it. It had to be part. And actually, one of her grandchildren was doing this, waiting doing a circle with her friends, waiting in line at a swim meet recently. Well, I think the phrase she was using, her granddaughter was using, was namaste, which is used in yoga. It's used in Eastern religions. It means I bow, but if you really look at the actual meaning of it, I bow to the spirit in you, to the divine in you, is what they're saying. Do we know what spirit is within another person? Especially when these are Christ-free lessons? Something to consider before bowing to anyone and saying that phrase, frankly. Let's go to the next slide. So I looked up social emotional vendors that are commonly used in many schools, and this is not an exhaustive list at all, that have mindfulness sequences, usually optional. Edgenuity, Panorama is very big. They have a way to log on at 11 a.m. Eastern Time daily for teachers and students for a mindfulness session. 7 Mindsets talks frankly about transcendental meditation. Second Step, Character Strong, Inner Explorer specializes in mindfulness, as does Mind Up. DBT Steps, Brain Pop, which is a popular short video producer, and Fly 5. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. So let's go to the next slide. So here are some more examples about how this is the materials. There's lots of materials, as well as the actual mindfulness session. There's materials to back this up that teachers can use as resources. Brain Pop has a short video. Meditating with Moby, see that on the screen, about mindfulness. And this girl is trying to figure out how to silence her brain chatter. Okay, so we have kids who have lots going on in their brains, and do you really want to silence children? Silence their own ideas, their own impressions, their own worldview, their own values, their own concerns? Let's go to the next slide. So another one is another vendor is called DBT Skills, and it's also called Steps. So a parent in the Marysville, Ohio schools sent me the following recently, a mom, and that's a suburb of Columbus. She gave me an example from the DBT Steps program, a handout for kids given to 5th graders, again, in a Marysville, Ohio school. And part of it says this: open your heart to a supreme being, greater wisdom, or your own wise mind. Ask for strength to bear the pain in this moment. So just open yourself up to whatever's there. Without the wisdom of God, folks, we humans can go down some very questionable and troubling roads, just opening ourselves up to anything out there. So the next slide then. So Inner Explorer is an SEL program that encourages kids to explore their inner selves. Former Ohio Congressman Tim Ryan was on the advisory board for this company. And can we, again, exploring our inner selves, is that what we want our children to do? But see the screen, it's evidence-based mindfulness. Yeah, right. Evidence-based. Okay. Follow the science. Okay, next slide. And then publishers have been quick to provide an array. There are so many books now on mindfulness for both teenagers and middle schoolers and grade schoolers. They're quick to jump on this mindfulness bandwagon. And of course, what this allows children to do is to take the mindfulness sessions from the home or from the school into their home and into their own lives. Again, the Christ-free sessions that are being allowed, because remember, this isn't religion, this is science, okay, now in our schools. So go to the next slide then. Excuse me. So I just looking at the 5 so-called competencies that if you've got children in schools, you will recognize that they are being, a lot of what they do is has a framework of these competencies. And I took a look at the 5 competencies of SEL and how mindfulness, and this is my view, I'm not quoting anyone else here, but how they might put these competencies on steroids, because really these 5 areas are meant to redevelop the child's values, beliefs, and worldview. I mean, that's really where we're getting And all of it, so much of it goes toward diversity, equity, and inclusion, and many woke agendas, quite frankly. But if you take self-awareness, if they're doing mindfulness and they're also being taught about self-awareness, they will tie the two together. Close your eyes, breathe, become aware of your senses, empty your mind. There's no right or wrong. Goldie Hawn talked frankly about how the kids would become more compassionate and kind and tolerant. Well, when you have an empty mind, you're pretty tolerant. Do we really want children with empty minds for whom everything is right? Self-management. You can learn to take those deep breaths to control anger, regulate your emotions, and try not to be so conflicted, not to worry about whether something's right or wrong. Pretend that it doesn't matter, frankly. Then social awareness, you go to other people and you use these new tolerance skills you've learned, you've emptied your mind, found objectionable. All of those kids at school that are now non-binary, that are dressing and acting as the opposite sex, you're supposed to we're all supposed to be civil, of course, always to those folks, but now you're supposed to find that to be respectful, and you're supposed to be embrace that for that person, or maybe even try it on yourself. Relationship skills. These are the new tolerant views that you will make friends from these new diverse backgrounds, affirm new values, maybe discard the ones you've always been taught. And then their version of responsible decision making under mindfulness might be being willing to defend these new values, maybe even become an activist and live them out daily, and in the process, possibly alienate yourself from your previous worldview, your parents, and everything you've been taught. So let's go to the next slide. So as I said before, teacher training programs, we could have a whole session on just this because they're everywhere on mindfulness. Continuing education programs, they are the wild card here. When you look at the structure, or you're told by the teacher, oh, we're just going to have kids close their eyes and just become more aware of themselves and think happy thoughts. Realize that the teachers have been trained in the deepest levels of mindfulness, almost always. I'm going to just refer to one teacher training program that the Minnesota Department of Education's Safe and Supportive Schools had in 2020. And someone from Child Protection League audited that. Let's go back to the previous slide. Audited that session and reported it to be heavy on occult elements and creepy, with a clear sense of demonic activity. That was the sense of what was going on in that room as those teachers were being trained. So let's go to the next slide. Yes, when teachers are trained in this, they usually are quite aware that it's not just secular. And as a result, we've had many communities quite concerned about mindfulness sessions in class. In Georgia, there were several rogue teachers had given individual students books about Buddhism and taught them to pray using crystals. So it doesn't just stop at these nice, quiet sessions. In Plains Township, Ohio, a program was discontinued because parents complained about the roots of mindfulness in Eastern religions. And the principal finally, he saw these concerns and he went along with it. So yes, you were sent out, by the way, when the last notice on announcing this webinar was a screenshot from the big education professional online periodical, Ed Week, which has an article about teachers taking up mindfulness. It's totally supportive. And in that article, this is the quote: mindfulness is a central element of Buddhism that is more than 2,500 years old, unquote. Yeah, they know it's part of religion. And I just want to make the comment that prayer is around 6,000 years old. And so it works quite well too. So are we going to have religion in school? Let's think about that. So the next slide then. So in North Central Ohio several years ago, parents and churches were very concerned about yoga programs and mindfulness that popped up in a whole range of school systems. And I mean, there were people working together to push this into schools. As a result, 105 clergy signed a letter directed to state officials and the superintendents of the schools in 6 counties. The letter cited relevant legal cases, explained the program content. The letter stated, quote, "The practice of Eastern religion in the classroom during school hours is a form of coercion due to its mandatory attendance, teacher authority, and peer pressure. In fact," I'm still quoting, "the endorsement of yoga is a violation of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which forbids government from picking religious winners and losers and enforcing its choice," unquote. So the letter went on to describe the content of the programs, including bowing to the sun god Surya during yoga and a mindfulness room featuring scrolls containing quotes by the Dalai Lama. As a result, several of the school districts did remove these programs. So the next slide. So what are the outcomes of mindfulness programs? Well, the proponents will tell you they improve focus, academic performance, reduce depression, stress, anxiety, even absenteeism. But there are other opinions, and they're not all from conservatives. Psychology Today last year was covering research on mindfulness programs. Here's what they found. The study reported that there was no significant benefit and actually caused more problems among many students with prior mental health issues. The researchers recommend that non-specific mindfulness interventions not be implemented in the school system. Psychology Today. Next slide. So there's another psychology journal also quoting on research. Research is making it clear that negative or adverse events during meditation are surprisingly common, even with people undertaking mindfulness practice at relatively low intensity. These vary in intensity and impact on the individual, can include experiences such as anxiety, agitation, insomnia, executive impairment, or impairments in social functioning. However, these approaches and related findings about adverse events are rarely included in the minimal training provided for teachers. Yes, that's exactly right. Nor are school boards and parents told about this. Okay, let's go to the next slide, which is really our last slide. What can we do? There are various approaches on how to do this. First of all, you need to find out exactly what's going on in your school, and a records request, open records request, or whatever you can do is extremely important. But I believe that we can use a no religion argument to remove this from schools. If we stay to a secular measurement, then they're going to win that argument, I believe, because that's what they want us to believe. We have to show the evidence that it is actually, it can creep or gallop toward Buddhist meditation. And we can cite the harms that I just mentioned. Also, we have to just keep up the pressure, because get churches involved, as these clergy did, as I mentioned before. Contact the schools, keep the accountability high, and don't let them get away with positioning this as something that it's not. So that's all I have to cover here. I'm happy to answer questions, or we can open it up for discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is a lot of information. I do have some questions here people would ask you to address. The first one is they're asking if you have the number of the House bill for that Pennsylvania legislation, and you may not have that, but if I write at your fingertips, but that was a question that somebody had here. There might be some people interested in looking at that.
Okay, I don't have it at my fingertips, but somebody may be listening who knows that, so maybe they can put it in the chat or the Q&A and let us know. Otherwise, Okay, go to missionamerica.com and the contact link there and just send me an email and I'll find it for you. And anything else you want to comment on this, the same thing, missionamerica.com, and go to the contact section.
Yeah, and maybe we'll have somebody here put that information in the Q&A for us to address. Okay, so here's a question. With the early use of the Bible in U.S. schools, educating the whole child and character education has been a central part of U.S. education from the beginning. Generally, the only option offered to SEL is the 3 R's, which is a regression from U.S. education history and indeed education practice for millennia. Lots to oppose in Eastern religion based on SEL. Lots to oppose in Eastern religion-based SEL, but are we being unwisely reactionary? Is there a third way? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and there are various options here. So one other option is to say, I think that it's dangerous even if you have an opt-out and you can opt your children out, because frankly, most parents are not going to opt their kids out. And so then you've got this all through your school and the mindset of the school. But you can try to press for opt out, not opt in, opt out, because they have to fully inform you and they cannot proceed unless they have, or opt in, I guess I want to say opt in, not opt out. Unless they have your signature, they cannot proceed. You don't want to have just a passive opt out. So that's one way to do it. We, ever since the Supreme Court decision that banned prayer in schools and this ridiculous idea that's not constitutional, as we must know, of separation of church and state, yes, tragically, Christian education has been lacking in many schools and has been banned. But bringing this in is very dangerous.
So you are referring to legislation that would make these things something you'd have to opt into. Is that correct?
That legislation or board policy, but yes, okay. I think that would be the only way it could possibly be tolerable. And I mean, I wouldn't just leave it there. I would say, okay, let's do religion in schools. How about a prayer time? Let's just see the reaction there.
Yeah. So if meditation is acceptable, how about prayer? And can we use the name of Jesus? So those are all questions people have, but that's the next questions that has come up is, what about lawsuits against this as a religion? Is that an option?
It could be. It depends on what. I think in a lawsuit, you have to show a harmful outcome. And so that would have to be documented. But yeah, I would say we have the one situation where the girl in Chicago, it didn't go to court because the school settled with her, but she had a really good case. She was offended by being forced to bow down to other little God figurines. And I think there are quite a few of these programs that go into explicitly occult territory of other religions. So Christians who are brave, yes, stand up and see if you can bring a lawsuit and at least hold the school accountable.
So they take liberties to do whatever they want in the schools, and they know that it's inconsistent with the policies that have been existing in the past, that we can't have any religion in the schools. They know that, but they're doing it anyway, and they're calling it it's not religion, and it clearly is. And when they're doing that, people have to challenge it, and it takes there are pro bono legal entities that take on these kinds of cases, and I think there should be pouring in lawsuit, checking it out. And like I said, pro bono entities, you don't necessarily need a lot of money, and you could even do a number of parents coming together as to do a lawsuit together against a program, but it's clearly unconstitutional. So the next question is, can you explain the link between mindfulness and how SEL causes so much cognitive dissonance in children? Mindfulness seems to be the cure offered to children in order to deal with their confused feelings and what they are seeing. Of course, they're providing the confusion. We can just start to name the reasons that they're confusing the children. So is this like their way of having the children deal with that, what's called cognitive dissonance?
That is an excellent observation. They create the problem, and now they have the solution to the problem they created. That's very likely because, yes, that brings in a key element here that we are noticing all of the stresses and anxiety and anger expressed by children in schools. We do know that children today have many more problems in the home level. They're bringing those problems with them to school, and that's part of the mental health state that so many kids are in. However, I believe the woke agendas, all of the emphasis on questioning your sexual orientation or your gender identity, the self-examination of all of that, the self-examination of the ridiculous racially hyped agenda that makes everything about something as shallow as skin color, and everyone's supposed to analyze themselves based on oppression. These are bringing stresses to children that they did not have before, nor do they need. And yes, it may be that to calm all of this down, you have to bring in, or the school believes, and some teachers believe, we'll bring in occult spirituality. It's very dangerous. The whole thing is a landmine, quite frankly.
Just imagine the burden, the emotional and spiritual burden that children have by identifying themselves as oppressors. I mean, they have to take that upon them, and they are. The emotional trauma that causes in children.
Right, and I remember, and many of you do as well, hearing and reading about stories of, especially several years ago when there was after the George Floyd riots, and especially you in Minnesota, I'm sure had a lot of this, where these programs at school would result in kids going home and screaming at their parents that they hated them, that they were oppressors, America was horrible, and the police were horrible, and so on. It's not grounded in fact, and it's not necessary to lay on our kids.
We have an incident, an example from a parent that was telling us that in his 13-year-old special ed student, she has special needs, would try to color her skin dark because she wanted to be accepted and affirmed. And it just breaks your heart. I mean, this is one student who actually expresses it that way, but there are so many that don't ever get that expressive, and yet they are feeling those same things. I am not affirmed. How can I be affirmed? And of course, that's how you jump into the transgender issue too. That's one way you get all kinds of affirmation, and there's such a need there to be accepted and affirmed, and you get that if you jump into certain special groups. So there's a little bit here where somebody is saying that let's see, mindfulness is connected to the fact that social emotional learning is built upon MTSS. Now, for those who aren't familiar that much with social emotional learning, MTSS is a multi-tiered system of support, which is the protocol that's used to assess every single student and put them into a track where they're assessing how they're moving along toward the social emotional goals. So she's saying here, trauma-informed education and mindfulness is one of their preferred interventions and behavioral management strategies. So all of this is by design, right? So the point she's trying to make here is that the way MTSS works is that you assess, you evaluate, you decide what kinds of interventions are needed. It's all looked at through basically a cultural Marxist lens, through a social emotional competency lens. They're looking at equity. How are these children moving along in the equity spectrum? And then they determine what kind of interventions, whether it's for a student or a class or a school, need to happen in order to move them along. And they're continually assessing, they're continually providing interventions. It's an ongoing evidence-based system. That's what they mean by evidence-based. So the question here is this mindfulness just one of the preferred interventions and behavioral managements that's part of the whole social emotional learning system of support?
Well, I believe it sounds like absolutely this will become an important piece of it, because what is the one quote I had in here, that they believe that this is the cure for mental health issues. So if you have a highly angry child for whatever reason, many of them are going to be boys, but not always, or self-destructive. And let's do mindfulness with this child. And the other thing is, it's not all group sessions. I didn't get into this at all. Some of these are more individual therapy sessions. Well, when you get into that, you've got a spiritual counselor right there in front of you who's been trained in these techniques. And the whole thing is, again, a minefield of kids that are going to blow up. And this is not going to help. This is going to hurt.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've encountered is that because this, there is so much mental health challenges in children today for obvious reasons. I mean, they're bombarded by the school. We've talked about that already here. But there's been so much of that in searching for solution, legislators, and I'm talking about good legislators, seem very willing to just pour money into the schools to give more mental health counselors, more school counselors, more all kinds of money for mental health issues into the schools. And they seem to miss the idea that this is intentional, and they're feeding the beast, because the more you put the mental health people in there, they're all trained, especially the school counselors. But any of the mental health people in the schools, they are trained in the science of equity. It's the social emotional learning, and they're teaching us cultural Marxist principles. It's an indoctrination system. And that's what troubles me, is that you have good legislators who are passing a lot of money over to these people to do more of what they do in the schools.
There's just millions of billions when we get to the national level, of both federal and state money going toward training and hiring more social workers and mental health counselors. And as somebody was saying, okay, you add 10 more counselors to your high school. What are they going to do? They have to justify their existence. They're going to find problems. And this is one thing that's happening. This is part of, as you said, the cultural Marxism. Let's fix the whole culture by making students and schools change agents. How do you make them change agents? Well, we got to dismantle all of their previous traditional values, and we do that through social emotional learning. And the religious and the meditation aspect, getting them at the spiritual level, corrupted spiritually, quite possibly, will seal the deal. This will make them into the hardcore anti-Judeo-Christian traditional students that they might otherwise have been. They a complete worldview change, complete behavioral change, angry people. You're not going to help the anger. This will accelerate the anger in a lot of kids.
I don't have the name of the organization on the tip of my tongue here, but the National Organization for School Counselors, if you go to that, and we should probably send that link out, because you should go to their website. They are completely taken over by the Marxists. And the counselors that are being trained and are being poured into the schools, their purpose is transformation. And I have seen a report from one of the school counselors on, I think it might have been on TikTok, that said, I never got any training in how to help them students apply for scholarships, or for what kind of help they can get getting into college, or the kinds of things a school counselor you would expect. She said, I didn't get any training on that, but I learned it on my own, because that's what the children need from me as a school counselor. There were a lot of other things that she mentioned. Just what I learned is how to teach them, about what oppressed group they're in. And that's the key to cultural Marxism, is that everybody is identified as either an oppressor or an oppressed, and they're a protected group, or they're a cultural oppressive group. So that's what's coming out of the school counselors. And we're having, like I said, good legislators pouring money into schools to get more counselors in the schools. And these people have been taken over. I'm sure there are some good ones there, but the whole system has been taken over. So another question here is there a resource available, like a one-page handout that lists some of the mindfulness techniques and its related religious roots? Is there anything like that?
There is not. Maybe we'll create one. So, okay.
Yeah. Another one is, do you know anything about Kairos retreat, Kairos, Kairos retreat for students? Is that something you know anything about?
No.
Okay.
There is
somebody needs to tell us something about that. Yeah. Okay. Can you more fully explain how a parent can opt out when SEL is fully embedded across all subjects and grade levels?
It's very difficult. What you have to do is, at the beginning of the school year, when they send all these forms home, you need to send a letter back and make sure you get a confirmation that you do not want your child to have surveys, that you do not want their data shared with anyone, which is another part of social emotional learning. And you do not want them taught about gender ideology and sexual orientation and any of the other elements that come into the racial equity issue, and nothing regarding the 5 competencies of social emotional learning. Now, you can try that. It might not work because it is embedded everywhere, but you at least have to. One of the things that happens there is they are put on notice that you have made this objection. If there's ever a problem, and put mindfulness on that opt out as well. If there's ever a problem, you have documentation that you notified the school. And so they're always looking for reasons not to be sued. And so it's always good to start there. That's the least we can do.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we have an opt-out policy in Minnesota, but as soon as they just last year, some of the Muslim parents said that we want to opt out of every single thing where there's any reference to LGBTQ, because that's against our religion. And all of a sudden, the opt-out policy is now in question because they're not going to do that. And yes. It's embedded everywhere. And they're saying, the Department of Education is going to have to clarify what opt-out really means, because if it means opting out of recognizing that we are here and we are affirmed and we're here, that we won't do. We won't allow. So, I mean, that's what we're dealing with. I mean, the system, we have to recognize the system has been taken over. I mean, there is really no way to adequately protect your children in the public school system right now. And my big problem right now is to see that people understand what mindfulness is, that they understand what SEL is, and they don't let it into their private schools, their non-public schools, because it's in there too. And it's coming into Christian schools. It's coming in, sometimes they have SEL, as they call it, Christian SEL. It is not Christian SEL. It's all deceptive. And so my best concern is to, if you recognize what it is and then you speak to it, because there's nothing as powerful as truth. The truth exposes, and people need to know what this is, and they don't, because the sound of it is so wonderful, and you're just kind of taken over by the lovely language of mindfulness, all calming your mind. It all sounds so good. You just made a great presentation of that. We need to know what this is. It is taking out any kind of spiritualism that has to do with Christ, and it has to do with anything except the Eastern meditation worldview that they intend to impose on us, and it's all coming. We have to recognize that and stand up against it, because if we don't, nobody will. So that's my little rant. Okay, so here's actually, this question is, so many good-willed people think the SEL language is good. Now we're back to social emotional learning. But this is true for mindfulness too. And they're embedded with each other. What is the best or most effective way to get them to see what's wrong with it without losing them by sounding too much like alarmists? Oh boy, that's a good question. Can you answer that?
The number one way is to say, get this stuff out of schools and get back to academics. Okay. This is time wasting. It is not your lane. Stay in your lane. Your lane is not to reshape the values, attitudes, and spirits of our children. Your lane is to teach them reading, writing, math, social studies, science. That's your lane. Stay in it and stop all this other stuff. So the more you can demonstrate that, for instance, in Ohio, Protect Ohio Children has done quite a bit on showing the reading proficiency levels and how abysmally low they are, and math proficiency. You have no business spending time on this. If you were in the corporate world, you folks would all be fired. You're not performing. Teachers are not performing, and it's we need to measure more of this and get away from the social engineering of all types.
Well, thank you. We have a couple more questions. I don't know. Let's see whether we should go on very much longer, but I'll just go on. Here's another one, and just going to have to wrap it up pretty soon here. Would it be fair to say if you don't have mindfulness, social emotional learning sort of implodes on itself? So the 5 pillars of SEL are essentially built off of mindfulness.
Wow, that's a huge question. Social emotional learning is like nailing Jello to the wall. It is applied in so many different ways throughout, and it's throughout the curriculum, throughout the day, that I couldn't answer that adequately based on all the different applications. That could be the case. But there's no way to know unless we see a specific example.
So are you aware of any Bible-based SEL curriculum or guidelines that we can suggest as an alternative in the schools, or in Christian schools, or in homeschool co-ops? So how can we avoid the occult in that? You want to address that?
Some of it broke up there, but I think there was all the SEL and the mindfulness. Is there a Christian?
Yeah, it was like, is there any Bible-based SEL? Is there such a thing? I'll just tell you. If you go ahead, answer. Go ahead.
Well, let me just tell you that the sad thing is that there have been for quite many years in many schools character education. Now, it was usually woven into something else, and it was Judeo-Christian based. It was not equity, diversity, and inclusion based. But so there have been some efforts to kind of take that and morph that into SEL so that you retain some of the good things about character education. I don't know if you're going to be able to protect it from all of the nonsense that's out there, because virtually all the vendors are tied into Castle, the mothership who originated SEL, and they set the standards, and they're all about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and all the LGBTQ and all of the semi-Marxist or flat out Marxist philosophies. So anything related to CASEL, you don't want. And most of the major vendors are assessed on the CASEL website and given grades, and they seek that, and they promote that, and you just don't want any of that. So it's hard. It's
So one of the most recommended from CASEL curriculum is called Character Strong, and it's all the same, but they want to bring in the idea that, oh, this is about building character, and they sell it that way. Oh, this is just building character. But the problem is you're bringing in a program that is, CASEL itself makes it clear that their purpose is to promote equity and social justice. They say that is the purpose. And what that is cultural Marxism. And that is the whole idea of social emotional learning. There is, to say that there's the social emotional learning is really a good thing. It's not. It's like to teach character is a good thing. You don't need a curriculum that comes from CASEL. And like there's one what's called a Bible-based curriculum called Frenzy, which is popular among some people.
Yes.
If you go on our website, there's a review of that curriculum. It claims that it's Bible-based. It looks at it through a scriptural lens, and it is not. And so that article just goes through it and shows here's what they say, and here's what it is. And the very fact that they are trying to deceive you by calling it something that they know that it is not tells you that this whole thing is an agenda. It's a very radical agenda that is finding itself into Christian and private schools and in homeschools, trying to tell us that this is a new thing. It's not. We always teach character. This has always been the case. You don't need social emotional learning to do something that Christian schools, private schools, and homeschools have always done.
Right. You teach character through, I'm a former language arts teacher. You teach character through literature and through the history, through social studies. You exemplify it. You have, you take heroes. People can do studies and book reports and papers on that. That's how you teach character. So
the other thing that you want to look for in any programs is if they're focused on the 5 cultural competencies, they all are defined for you really nicely, very benignly. Those are all tied into the CASEL SEL program. I mean, those are talking points. And if they are focused on the 5 cultural competencies, which is the definition of SEL, by the way, you don't want that, because you can define for yourself what you want to teach in your school, and you don't need to go on the 5 cultural competencies, because those are defined in practice in a very different way from what you see given to you. And here's a question that you might have an interest in answering. Have you heard of the increased training of mental health professionals in the use of hallucinogenics, taking occult mindfulness practices to a new level? Is that something you're familiar with?
I've heard a smattering of it, but not enough to speak to it. So yeah, I think that's out there, unfortunately. Yes.
Say that again. I didn't quite catch that.
I have heard of this, just a smattering, and that's all I know. Okay.
So we've heard of it, don't know much more about it. Well, listen, I'm going to have to call this to a close. It's been really, really helpful. And, we're just honored to have you here, Linda, and so grateful that you could do this. On our website, we have a whole section on SEL, and it includes things in mindfulness. We're going to put this up on our website under mindfulness, and check that out. There's just so much. And if you have examples of things that, where this is coming in that might be helpful for us to know, we can be reached at contact@cplaction.com. And Linda, why don't you tell them again how to reach you?
Yeah, the best way to reach me is to go to the website, missionamerica.com, and then there's a contact link, and email me from there.
Okay, well, very, very good. Thank you so much. And goodbye, everybody. Thank you for joining us.